The mansion stood like a fortress on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling monument of glass and stone that seemed to rise above the world with disdain. It belonged to Alexander Harrington, a billionaire known for his brilliance in business and his ruthlessness in life. Everything about the estate spoke of wealth: marble staircases, priceless paintings, chandeliers that dripped with crystals, but one thing was conspicuously absent: the sound of children. For years, Alexander had forbidden any trace of childhood inside those walls. No toys. No laughter. No cries of joy or mischief. To him, children were a disruption, a reminder of something he had buried deep inside and sworn never to face again. The staff whispered about it in hushed tones. Some said he had lost a child once, though no one knew the details. Others claimed he simply hated children, seeing them as messy, loud, and unworthy of his carefully curated world. Whatever the reason, every maid and butler knew the rule: no child must ever step foot in the mansion. It was iron law. Those who questioned it didn't last long. But fate has its own way of testing the walls people build around themselves. The test came in the form of Isabella Martinez, a young maid hired to keep order in the vast house. Isabella was in her late 20s, with quiet resilience etched into her every movement. Life had not been kind to her. She had been widowed far too young, left to raise her twin children alone while trying to make ends meet. Taking the job at Harrington's mansion was not just a matter of survival, it was her last chance to secure stability for her children, Matteo and Sofia. She had been warned about the rule on her first day. The head butler, Mr. Davies, told her in a voice low and stern, "No children, Mrs. Martinez. The master doesn't tolerate them. Under no circumstances are your twins to come here. Do you understand?" Isabella had nodded, though her heart tightened at the thought of hiding such an enormous part of her life. For weeks she obeyed. She left her children with a neighbor each morning and returned to them at night, exhausted but grateful they were safe. Yet the arrangement was fragile. The neighbor grew restless, and Isabella could see the cracks forming in her ability to care for them. Then came the day everything changed. It was a stormy morning when Isabella arrived at work, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Matteo had been ill the night before, burning with fever, and Sofia clung to her mother with fear. Isabella couldn't leave them behind, not when every cough shook her son's small frame. She made a desperate decision, one she knew could cost her the job. She wrapped them in coats, whispered for them to stay silent, and slipped them into the mansion through the side entrance usually reserved for deliveries. Inside, the twins stayed hidden in the laundry room as Isabella rushed through her tasks. She prayed Alexander would not notice, that the children would remain unseen until the end of her shift. But fate, once set in motion, does not pause for human fear. At midday, as Isabella balanced a tray of tea destined for the study, Sofia slipped away. She was a curious child, wide-eyed and brave in ways that frightened her mother. The girl wandered into one of the great halls where golden light poured from high windows, her small footsteps echoing against the marble floor. And that was where Alexander Harrington found her. He froze, the tray in his hand trembling as if the sight before him was a ghost. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood staring at a painting that had haunted him for years, the portrait of his late wife, Emily. The resemblance was uncanny. The same dark curls. The same eyes full of innocence and light. For a moment, Alexander's chest tightened as though a phantom hand gripped it. Memories surged back, memories he had spent a lifetime suppressing. Sofia turned and saw him. Instead of shrinking back from the stern figure in the tailored suit, she smiled, a pure, unguarded smile that disarmed him completely. Alexander's voice, usually sharp and commanding, caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his tone wavered. Before Sofia could answer, Isabella appeared, her face pale as death. She dropped to her knees, clutching her daughter's shoulders, stammering apologies. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrington. Please forgive me. I had no choice, my son is ill, and I couldn't leave them alone. It won't happen again. Please don't fire me." Alexander's eyes flicked between the mother and child, his jaw tight with unspoken rage, but also something else, something softer, buried under years of bitterness. He should have ordered them out immediately. He should have ended it there. And yet, he didn't. He stood in silence, staring at Sophia as though she carried a key to a locked chamber inside him. In that moment, the iron rule of the mansion cracked. Mr. Davies arrived at a near run, smoothing his cuffs as if decorum alone could rewind what had happened. His eyes widened when he saw the child, then Isabella, then Alexander standing motionless like a statue someone had forgotten to dust. "Sir," he began carefully, "there must be some misunderstanding. Mrs. Martinez knows the rule." Alexander didn't answer at first. He studied Sophia the way a man studies a flame he expects to burn him. The child had stepped closer to the portrait, her chin tilted up in solemn concentration, then she looked back at him. "She looks kind," Sophia said softly, pointing to the painted woman. "Is she your mama?" The words landed like a bell toll through stone. Mr. Davies inhaled sharply. Isabella's hand tightened around her daughter's shoulder. Alexander's throat worked as if speech were a pain he had long ago given up. "No," he said at last, the syllable brittle. "She was the only person who ever called this house a home." Silence pressed in. Somewhere far away, rain tapped against the glass like an impatient guest. Then from the corridor came a muffled cough, a small, ragged sound that didn't belong to marble or chandeliers. Isabella flinched. "Matteo," she breathed, and for the first time Alexander noticed the tremor in her posture wasn't fear but divided attention. A mother standing between a rule and a fever. "Where is he?" Alexander asked. "In the laundry room," she whispered, eyes pleading. "He's sleeping. He had a fever all night. I couldn't, there was no one, please, I only meant to finish my work and take them home. Rules are the scaffolding of a life built to keep collapse away. But even scaffolds groan when a storm shifts direction." Alexander looked at Mr. Davies, then at Isabella. "Bring the boy here," he said. Quietly. Isabella hesitated, disbelieving, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. Mr. Davies, recovering his sense of duty, stepped close enough to murmur, "Sir, this is not wise. You have always—" "I know what I have always done," Alexander said, not raising his voice. "Today is not always." Sophia remained beside him without the slightest fear, her gaze moving from the portrait to his face and back again. "She's pretty," the girl said, almost to herself. "She looks like she liked music." "She did," Alexander answered before he could stop himself. The memory came unbidden, a Sunday afternoon, sunlight on the piano lid, Emily's hair loose at her shoulders, laughter that had sounded like a promise no one could break. He could hear 2 notes of a lullaby she used to hum and had not allowed himself to remember in years. Isabella returned with Matteo wrapped in a thin blanket, his cheeks flushed with that peculiar crimson fever lends to small faces. He blinked against the brightness of the hall, breathing fast. Instinct overpowered everything in Alexander, the past, the rule, even the pride that had bricked over grief. He crossed the space before he realized he was moving. "How high?" he asked. 102 last night." It dropped, then rose again. Her voice shook. "I gave him medicine, but—" "Bring him to the blue sitting room," Alexander said. "It's closer to the kitchen and the east windows." He turned to Mr. Davies. "Ask Mrs. Patel to prepare ginger tea, toast lightly buttered, and a bowl of ice water with cloths. Also call Dr. Kellerman. Tell him to come at once." Mr. Davies stood absolutely still for one heartbeat too long. "Yes, sir," he said finally, then vanished with the efficient glide of a man taught to obey the impossible without comment. The blue sitting room was the gentlest chamber in the mansion. Emily had chosen its hues, a tender compromise between sea and sky. Alexander had not entered it in years. As they stepped inside, something loosened and ached all at once. Isabella laid Matteo on the upholstered chaise with a care that made the room itself seem to hold its breath. Sophia climbed onto a low ottoman and watched, solemn as a sparrow. "Thank you," Isabella said, unable to keep the gratitude from cracking her composure. "I will leave as soon as the doctor says. Fire me if you must." I don't want trouble for anyone. Alexander shook his head. No one is being fired. The words surprised him with their own calm. He knelt, the rich carpet denting under his knees, and studied the boy the way he studied risk, methodically, without panic. Mateo, he said, testing the name. The boy's lashes fluttered. Do you feel more cold or more hot? Hot, Mateo whispered. But my hands are cold. His small fingers sought his sister's. Sophia scooted closer, a tiny guardian. Mrs. Patel arrived with a tray, eyes widening when she saw the children but face smoothing into kindness as old as kitchens. She set down the tea, the toast, the bowl of ice, and left without a sound. Alexander wrung a cloth, cooled it, and handed it to Isabella. She pressed it gently to Mateo's forehead. It's okay, mi amor, she murmured in Spanish, her voice a bomb. Just breathe. Sophia glanced around, noticing something the adults had forgotten, a narrow cabinet along the wall with a closed lid. Is that a piano? She asked. Alexander nodded. Do you play? Not anymore, he said. Can I see? Another time, Isabella said quickly. We have to be quiet. But Sophia had the diplomacy of the innocent. She folded her hands and sat very straight, as if the piano might open just because she behaved. Alexander almost smiled. Almost. Later, he said softly, and the girl accepted the promise as if it were settled law. Dr. Kellerman arrived with the brisk scent of rain on wool. He examined Mateo, asked questions, pressed stethoscope to small ribs. Influenza, most likely, he concluded. Run of the mill, but it can feel like a storm in a teacup. He needs fluids, rest, something for the fever. He's fortunate to be somewhere warm. The doctor turned to Alexander with a searching look, surprised but too professional to pry. I'll send over a proper thermometer and medication. When the doctor left, the storm moved off the windows, leaving a rinsed light behind. Mateo sipped tea in small heroic attempts. Sophia, seeing the tension ease, whispered, Can I draw? Isabella's bag yielded a stubby pencil and a folded receipt. The girl bent over it and began to sketch the portrait she had seen in the hall, the woman with kind eyes. Only in Sophia's drawing, the woman had a small child's hand tucked inside her own. Alexander stood at the window with his back to them, but the image found him anyway. He realized with a start that the past he had been outrunning had simply been walking beside him, waiting to be named. The rule had been a moat, yes, but moats run dry when no river feeds them. What remained was only hunger and silence. Mr. Harrington, Isabella said quietly. He turned. She was standing, shoulders squared. I won't abuse your kindness. As soon as Mateo sleeps, I'll take them home and I'll find another arrangement. This will not happen again. He studied her, as he would a ledger that refused to balance because it contained a line he had not known he'd written. Mrs. Martinez, he said, you will not take him into the rain. He stays until the fever breaks. Both of them do. Isabella shook her head, disbelief and relief colliding. I can't ask for. You didn't, he said. After a moment he added, quieter, I remember what it is to have a house and no home. The children did what children do in the absence of fear, they shaped the room to fit their small lives. Sophia arranged her pencil and paper on the ottoman, feet not touching the floor, and hummed something under her breath, a lilting tune that made Alexander's skin tighten. It wasn't exact, just a child's guess at melody, but it carried the curve of Emily's lullaby through the blue air, and for the first time in years he let it reach him without flinching. Later, when the house had adjusted to this new, tender gravity, Mr. Davies returned with an inventory of logistics, medication delivery time, meal adjustments, a guest room prepared. He paused at the threshold, taking in the sight, the billionaire at the piano, not playing but standing close enough to rest his hand on the closed lid, the maid on the chaise, her son asleep against her side, the little girl sketching without apology. Shall I inform the staff of a temporary suspension of policy? He asked. Inform them, Alexander said, that compassion has replaced it. He let out a breath he had not realized he was keeping. And, Davies, unlock the music room. When the butler left, Sophia looked up, hopeful and immediate. Does that mean we can see? She asked, pointing to the cabinet again. Alexander considered the simple danger of yes. It means, he said at last, that some doors were locked for the wrong reasons. He lifted the lid. The piano's ivory smiled back in quiet rows. Dust motes rose like forgiven things. In the hallway beyond, the portrait waited as it always had, watching with paint and patience while the house, at last, remembered how to hold the living. The following morning, the mansion woke to sounds it had long forgotten. Not the clash of silverware or the rustle of servants moving quietly in the halls, but the faint laughter of children echoing through marble corridors. It was timid at first, like a melody learning to find its notes, but it spread with such insistence that even the walls seemed to listen. Matteo's fever had broken sometime near dawn. Isabella had stayed awake most of the night, dozing lightly in a chair by his side, her hand resting protectively over his chest as though touch alone could anchor him to safety. When she opened her eyes and saw the calm rise and fall of his breathing, tears welled up. Relief, exhaustion, gratitude, they blended together until she could barely tell which was which. Alexander, too, had been awake. He had not planned it, yet something drew him back to the blue sitting room every few hours. Once to check the boy's temperature, once to bring an extra blanket, once more just to stand in the doorway, silent, watching. He told himself it was responsibility, that since he had broken his own rule, he now bore the consequence. But deep down, another truth stirred, he had not felt this alive in years. By morning, Matteo was weak but alert. He asked for toast, his small voice raspy, and Mrs. Patel practically flew to prepare it. Sophia, restless as the storm outside receded into sunlight, wandered through the corridors with wide eyes. "It's too quiet here," she declared when she returned. "Even the air sounds empty." Alexander overheard her. He was sitting in the study, surrounded by books that had become little more than trophies of intellect. He lowered his newspaper and said, "This house was built for silence. For order." Sophia tilted her head. "Then it was built wrong." Isabella gasped softly, but Alexander didn't scold the child. Instead, he studied her with the kind of fascination one reserves for an honest mirror. Few people dared contradict him. Fewer still did it without guile. This little girl had managed both, and somehow it didn't sting. Later, Isabella tried to keep the children contained in the small guest room Alexander had reluctantly allowed them. But confinement never suited children. Sophia found excuses to slip out, carrying her paper and pencil to capture the mansion's corners, chandeliers, staircases, a vase taller than she was. Matteo, though weak, insisted on sitting by the window to watch the gardeners at work. He pressed his palm against the glass, whispering questions. Why does the man cut the bushes into squares? Do the roses hurt when they're trimmed? At first Isabella hushed him, afraid of overstepping boundaries. But to her surprise, Alexander himself came to answer. The roses bloom stronger when pruned, he explained, standing by the boy's chair. Pain, in its way, teaches them to flourish. Matteo blinked up at him. Do people bloom stronger with pain too? The question hung heavy. Isabella's lips parted, ready to redirect, but Alexander spoke first. Some do, he admitted. Some don't. His eyes drifted toward the gardens, but his mind was far away, in a nursery that once existed, in laughter that had been silenced too soon. That afternoon, Sophia made her boldest move yet. She tugged Alexander's sleeve and pointed toward the music room, now unlocked. You promised, she said simply. He should have refused. Promises, after all, were fragile things. Yet he followed her inside, Isabella trailing behind with Matteo leaning against her side. The room smelled faintly of dust and memory, its grand piano sitting like a beast too long neglected. Sunlight cut across its polished surface, and Alexander's reflection stared back at him. Play something, Sophia urged. His chest tightened. I don't play anymore. Why not? She asked. He hesitated. Because music remembers. Isabella glanced at him, sensing the depth of those words but saying nothing. Sophia frowned, then hopped onto the bench herself. Her little fingers pressed random keys, producing a jumble of sound that should have been ugly but somehow wasn't. It was untrained, chaotic, yet alive. The room, starved of music for so long, seemed to lean forward eagerly. Matteo laughed weakly at his sister's performance, clapping his small hands. "That's not music," he teased. "It is to me," Sophia shot back, grinning. She looked up at Alexander again. "Show me how it's supposed to sound." And for the first time in over a decade, Alexander sat. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He pressed one note, then another. At first it was halting, uncertain, but muscle memory carried him. Soon the hesitant notes flowed into a melody, a fragment of the lullaby Emily used to hum, the one he swore he would never hear again. Isabella felt her breath catch. The children fell silent, wide-eyed. Even the house seemed to listen. The melody carried grief, yes, but also tenderness, like a wound that hurt because it had once been whole. When he stopped, the silence that followed was not empty but full. Sophia whispered, "It sounds like love." Alexander's throat tightened. He stood abruptly, retreating to the window before anyone could see the moisture gathering in his eyes. "That's enough," he said gruffly. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, was already done. The walls of his fortress had begun to crumble, not with force, but with the small, persistent weight of two children who refused to see him as untouchable. That night, as Isabella tucked her twins into the guest room bed, she whispered a prayer of thanks. Yet in her heart, fear gnawed. Alexander's kindness might vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The man was unpredictable, wounded, and powerful. And if he chose tomorrow to banish them, she would have no choice but to obey. Still, as she closed her eyes beside them, one truth lingered: something had shifted in the mansion, something no rule could undo. By the second day, the mansion had adjusted to a new weather system. Staff schedules bent quietly to the orbit of two small suns. Doors that had stayed shut for years were left a little ajar. The kitchen learned the grammar of small appetites. Alexander moved through it all with a wary awareness, present, attentive, but never lingering long enough to be accused of caring. He signed documents at the breakfast table rather than barricading himself in the study, pausing to ask Matteo whether the tea tasted too bitter, glancing at Sophia's latest sketch as if it were an architectural draft demanding review. Mr. Davies took the change as one takes an unexpected draft through a well-sealed window, with good posture and a discreet adjustment of the curtains. Mrs. Patel pretended she had always kept honey for tea in a jar shaped like a bear. The gardeners, sensing the new order, trimmed a passage through the roses into a soft curve instead of the usual right angle. It was as if the estate had found an older map under the newer one, and the lines were clearer there. Still, rules resent being replaced. They rattle their chains and look for a chance to prove themselves necessary. That chance came in the way small chances always do, in a moment of unsupervised curiosity. Isabella had stepped away to speak with the housekeeper about linens when Sophia spotted the cat, a sleek, indifferent creature that appeared and vanished like a rumor. It slunk out of a narrow corridor that the children had not yet discovered. Matteo, stronger now but still pale, followed his sister at a careful pace. The corridor smelled faintly of cedar and something like old soap. At its end, a door held a tarnished brass knob in an obstinate silence. Sophia tried the knob. It turned with a stubborn sigh. The room beyond was dim and dust-sweet. At first it seemed empty, then the outlines asserted themselves: a narrow bed, a low bookshelf, a rocking chair. A mobile hung from the ceiling, wooden birds caught mid-flight. On a small dresser sat a music box the color of rain. Sophia stepped forward, reverent. Matteo hovered in the doorway, swallowed. "We shouldn't," he whispered. "It's sad in here," Sophia said, not as a warning but as a fact. She lifted the lid of the music box. The mechanism woke like a creature startled from sleep. A thin, delicate tune spilled out, halting, then gathering itself into a melody Alexander had tried to banish from the world. It was the lullaby, Emily's lullaby, rendered in the tin voice of a wound-up memory. The sound found him in the hall. He had been negotiating on the phone with a board member named Lang, a man who believed profit was proof of virtue. The music cut the call cleanly in half. Alexander's hand lowered as if weighted, the words in his ear blurred. "I have to go," he said, and hung up before the argument could pin him back to the safe, cold world. He didn't hurry. He moved the way a person moves toward a cliff they know is there, knowing that pretending not to see it won't stop the edge from arriving. The open door, the dust, the music, he stood in the doorway long enough for the children to look up and realize that they had trespassed into a living man's private grave. Sophia shut the lid with a small, apologetic click. "I'm sorry," she said. "We were following the cat. We didn't know." "Out," Alexander said. The word was soft but final. Matteo grabbed his sister's hand. They slipped past him like ripples slipping around a rock. Isabella arrived at the same moment from the opposite direction and saw the room over the children's shoulders. Color fled her face. She had learned enough, in 2 days, to know that a house this large keeps not only rooms but sanctuaries and punishments. "I should have watched them," she said, voice low. "Mr. Harrington, Alexander lifted a hand. "It isn't their fault." He stepped inside and Isabella, after a breath that hurt to take, followed. He didn't look at her. He looked at the bed, the chair, the mobile, each as if it were a person who had been waiting to be acknowledged. Dust motes turned in the air, and for a heartbeat the room looked like a snow globe someone had shaken. "Whose room is this?" Isabella asked, not because she didn't know, but because sometimes a question is a softer bridge than a silence. "My son's," he said. The 2 words did not shatter him the way he had feared they would. They lowered a gate behind his ribs and let the world in. It was meant to be. The chair was Emily's. She would sit there and tell me the names she liked. We argued about birds for the mobile. She wanted swallows, I insisted on starlings. Small, insignificant wars that lovers start to avoid naming the siege that's already begun. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, a king exiled to a tiny island of sheet and wood. Isabella remained standing, close enough to be a witness but far enough to leave him his dignity. "It was the pool," he said. "Not the way people assume, but grief does not care for facts." Emily's sister visited with her toddler on a spring afternoon. A gardener left the side gate unlatched. The boy wandered out. The water was still, bright as glass. They found him in time, and he survived, but the moment changed the shape of the air. The fear was a second shadow that followed us everywhere. We hired fences, guards, rules. We drew lines on a map and called it safety, then slept badly anyway. He looked at the music box. We tried again. A pregnancy. A name we never settled on. We made a nursery and waited and told ourselves that waiting was a kind of living. Then Emily's car spun on black ice not 2 streets from this house, and both were gone before I arrived. After the funeral, I came into this room and made a decision: if a house cannot protect what it shelters, then it will shelter less. I banish children not because I hate them but because I cannot survive another room like this one. Isabella's throat burned. "Pain is not a promise," she said softly. "But neither is love. We choose the risk we can live with. You chose walls. I understand." He finally looked at her. What he saw there seemed to both steady and unsettle him. "You will take them away tonight," he said, and the sentence was almost gentle. "I have kept them too long. I thought I could, that it would be temporary. But I can feel the old terror circling. If I let it in, I will hurt what I wish to protect." Isabella nodded once, the way a soldier nods when the order is clear and cruel. "I'll pack their things," she said. The room tilted. She steadied herself by the doorframe. "Thank you for what you've done. I won't forget it." He rose, closed the music box himself, and the lullaby's last note quivered and died. "I won't forget either," he said. In the corridor, the children waited small and solemn on the bench Mr. Davies used while polishing the banister. Sophia swung her legs without touching the floor. Matteo's fingers worried the edge of his blanket. Isabella knelt, smoothing their hair with hands that wanted to hold them forever. "We're going to go home this evening," she said, careful with her voice. "Say thank you for the kindness we were shown." Sophia nodded bravely. Matteo's face folded. "But the piano," he whispered. "Another time," Isabella lied, and it hurt as lies to the innocent always do. Practicalities move in when grief has done its first, loud work. Isabella gathered the small colony of things that had accumulated in 2 days: pencils, a sweater, half a pack of tissues, the receipt drawings turned into a fragile gallery. Mrs. Patel packed sandwiches in brown paper as if they were talismans. Mr. Davies had a car brought round, the smaller one, the one used when a journey should not be remarked upon. Alexander retreated to the study the way a wounded creature retreats to brush, not to hide, but to watch. The phone he had abandoned earlier pulsed insistently with the life of the world that didn't care about music boxes or mobile birds. He answered when the caller ID flashed Lang again. "You went silent," Lang said without greeting. "Unacceptable day to be unreachable." "We're finalizing the Haymarket acquisition." "Finalize it," Alexander said. His voice was the correct temperature again, cool, precise. "Send the papers." "You sound like you've been swimming," Lang said, suspicious of any tone he didn't recognize. "Listen, I saw something this morning that might interest you." A pause, oily with intention. "A photo crossed my desk. You know people send me things. Looked like a little girl in your East Hall. Cute. Out of place. I told the sender it must be a mistake. Harrington's fortress doesn't allow children." A silence that was not empty expanded in Alexander's ear. "Delete it," he said. "I will," Lang lied as easily as he breathed. "But photographs are like rumors, once born, they don't die, they multiply. I'd tighten the perimeter if I were you. People like to believe that rich men soften before they fall." When the call ended, Alexander stared at the books that had once taught him how to turn pressure into profit. He thought of Sophia's certainty, then it was built wrong, and of Matteo's question, do people bloom stronger with pain? The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the rule to return and restore order. At dusk, the twins came to say goodbye. Sophia stood with her chin high, the way she did when courage was needed. Matteo hovered half a step behind, eyes wet and stubbornly unblinking. Isabella kept to the side, letting them own the moment, though every part of her wanted to gather them and flee before kindness could be rescinded or punished. "Thank you for the blue room," Sophia said. "And for the tea with the honey bear." "And the piano," Matteo added, voice wobbling. Alexander inclined his head. His mouth formed words he had not planned. "The piano exists whether or not you hear it," he said softly. "That's what I forgot." Sophia took a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. It was the drawing she had. Portrait, only now there were 3 figures, the woman with kind eyes, a man whose shoulders were less squared than usual, and a child between them, holding both their hands. "I think she wanted you to remember," Sophia said. He accepted the paper as if it were a verdict, and perhaps it was. Outside, the car engine murmured to readiness. Mr. Davies stepped forward with the tact of a man who can read endings. Isabella touched the twins' backs to guide them toward the door. The bell at the front gate rang. No one used the bell. The intercom, the cameras, the coded drives, those were the mansion's language. The bell was human and therefore suspect. Mr. Davies froze. Alexander lifted a hand and went himself. On the screen beside the door, a woman stood in the last light of day. She was in her 50s, raincoat unbuttoned, hair damp, eyes bright with the exhaustion of traveling through a short distance that takes years. When she looked into the camera, time rearranged itself. "Emily's mother," Alexander said, breathless in a way that had nothing to do with stairs. He opened the door. She stepped inside a fraction, past and present colliding in the doorway. Her gaze flicked over his shoulder and landed, inevitably, on the children waiting with their mother near the hall's edge. The woman's hand went to her mouth. Not shock. Not scandal. A recognition as simple and as complicated as love. I heard a lullaby, she said, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. And I needed to see if the house remembered how to listen. Behind Alexander, Isabella's hand found each twin's shoulder. The car waited. The rule hovered. The night held itself poised on its own threshold, not yet choosing which story it would let in. The bell's reverberation thinned into evening hush, but the house did not return to silence. It held its breath. Alexander stood with Eleanor just inside the threshold, a man who had run from a single moment for so long that when it finally found him, he did not flee. Isabella kept a steady hand on each twin's shoulder, ready to move at the first sign of danger, emotional or otherwise. The car idled beyond the portico like an option that would disappear if not taken. Somewhere deep in the estate, a grandfather clock cleared its throat and began to count the seconds as if they were witnesses. Eleanor's gaze did not accuse, it measured the distance between the life she had buried and the one that might yet be rescued. I heard the old lullaby, she said, not taking her eyes off the twins. I didn't come to judge you, Alexander. I came to see if the house remembered how to listen. It remembers, he managed. I'm the one who forgot. His voice roughened. They were leaving. Eleanor echoed. She turned to Isabella with the simple, practical gentleness of women who have mended more than cloth. And do you wish to go, dear? Isabella's answer was automatic and honest. I wish to keep them safe. She looked at Alexander then, not as employer, not as savior, but as a man standing at a crossroads with his hands no longer empty. If staying here makes them a rumor that hurts them, we'll go. As if conjured by the word, the intercom on the hall table flickered. Mr. Davies glanced down, startled, and then composed himself with that quiet competence that could steady a moving train. Sir, he said, the gate guard reports a car lingering just outside the hedge. He believes someone is taking photographs. A shiver ran the length of the corridor, touching chandeliers and picture frames and the edge of the piano bench. Alexander remembered Lang's oily voice, the warning dressed as advice. He had wanted time, private, ordinary time, to practice kindness in the privacy of his shame. The world rarely grants that. He looked at the children, at Isabella, at Eleanor. There were a dozen ways to retreat and none to keep the promise he had made to himself in the blue light of the sitting room. Unlock the front doors, he said. Davies blinked. Sir? Unlock them, Alexander repeated, stepping toward the massive brass handles that had been polished more than they had been touched. If they want a picture, give them one worth taking. Eleanor's mouth softened into the hint of a smile that had crossed her features only once since she rang the bell. Good, she whispered. Davies obeyed. The doors sighed open to the dusk, revealing the sweep of steps and the gravel beyond. Alexander did not pose, he simply stood, with the twins at his side and Isabella a pace behind, Eleanor a solemn witness. The hedge trembled as a lens glinted and darted. Somewhere a car door thudded, indecisive. He felt the old panic rise, the instinct to slam, lock, erase. He did not. Will they be angry? Matteo asked, so quietly that the question seemed to thread itself through the lamplight rather than travel the air. Some will, Alexander said, every syllable in acceptance. Some always are when something changes. Then we should change louder, Sophia decided, as if rearranging a drawing. He took a breath that reached places in his chest he had not visited in years. Come, he said, and led them back inside, not as a retreat but as an arrival. The doors remained open, night air moved through the hall in small cleansing currents. The portraits watched, their oils drying a little more into the past. Eleanor did not waste the momentum. If you mean this, she said, you must make it real on purpose. Houses break habits only when given new ones. He nodded. Tomorrow, he said to Davies, invite the staff and their families to the south lawn. Music. Food. Games. The word felt strange in his mouth and then, to his surprise, pleasant. And call the foundation office. We're opening the gardens every Saturday for children from the city. The rules will be safety, respect, and as much laughter as the roses can tolerate. Davies wrote without visible emotion, but his pen stuttered with something like relief. "Yes, sir." "Not sir," Sophia piped up. "Alexander." He said so. Davies allowed himself the smallest inclination of a head that had witnessed empires rise and household budgets fall. "Yes, Alexander." Isabella did not move. There are turns in life so sharp a person must test the ground with their eyes before trusting their feet. "And when the stories come," she asked quietly. "When the photos spread out of context, when people ask why a billionaire keeps a maid's children under his roof?" "Then we answer with context," Eleanor said before Alexander could, her voice as steady as a churchyard wall. "We answer with hours of homework at the kitchen table and muddy shoes by the back door and a broken teacup that no one scolds because someone was dancing. We answer with the kind of life that makes gossip boring." Alexander breathed out, almost a laugh. "If there is scandal," he said, turning to Isabella, "let it be that I finally learned to be human." She held his gaze, something like a storm clearing behind her eyes. "And we will not be props," she said, "because truth spoken early is easier to keep. They are not charity. They are guests," he said immediately, and then, hearing the hollowness of the word, corrected himself. "They are the children this house should have always held. You are not beholden. If you stay, it will be because you choose to, and you can choose otherwise at any moment." It was not a contract. It was better. It was a promise whose enforcement was conscience. Night fell fully, and with it came the familiar unease that had patrolled the halls for years, a sentinel of absence. Except now it found the front doors unlatched, the piano unshrouded, the blue sitting room lamp burning. It hesitated. In its place came smaller sentinels, the sounds of someone breathing in sleep, of water run to rinse a cup, of a pencil scratching lightly as Sophia finished a sketch of the open doorway with stars just visible beyond. They ate together at a table that had hosted deals and funerals but never, in memory, ordinary soup for five. Mrs. Patel served with a ceremony she usually reserved for holidays. Matteo, still not entirely himself, fell asleep against Isabella's side before dessert. Eleanor offered to carry him. Isabella looked at her for a long second, then nodded, and between them they ferried the boy to the guest room that would not be called temporary for much longer. When Isabella returned to the hall, she found Alexander by the piano, lit up, keys breathing the faint ivory scent of a museum restored to use. He didn't play at first. He stood with one hand on the wood and looked toward the open doors where the night lay, not threatening but immense. He loved a name, he said without preface, voice low so as not to wake the house. I never said it out loud after the funeral. It felt like a betrayal to let the air hold it when he never got to. We had written it once on a scrap I can't find. Gabriel. He tasted the syllables like water after a long thirst. His name was Gabriel. Isabella swallowed. Grief is a language with free translation. A mother understands a father even when the grammar is foreign. Then let the house learn it, she said. Gabriel. And let it learn these too. She touched Sophia's braid. Sophia. She touched the doorway where Eleanor's shadow moved softly. Eleanor. She tapped her own chest, small, almost embarrassed at the vulnerability it required. Isabella. And Matteo is asleep, so we will say his name quietly so it doesn't wander from his dreams. Something eased in Alexander, something tight and iron that had insisted on being guard and had forgotten it was also prisoner. He sat and, without warning, began to play not the lullaby, but a plain, strong sequence of chords that sounded like a door whose hinges were oiled for the first time in a decade. It was an art. It was permission. The next morning arrived with proof that choices made at night can survive sunlight. A truck from the foundation rolled up the drive with folding tables, bright pennants, and a battered crate of children's books that smelled like school. The gardeners, equal parts scandalized and intrigued, shifted their routines to accommodate a small parade of life. Mrs. Patel argued with a bakery over the price of 6 dozen cinnamon rolls and won by the margin of a story about my employer who finally remembered he has a heart. By noon, the South Lawn resembled a festival still learning its name. A handful of staff children arrived first, tentative as deer. Davies, impeccable even among balloons, printed simple signs, "Welcome, please run carefully," piano recital at 4, and clipped them on string with wooden pins. Isabella stood under the elm with Sophia and Matteo, watching. She had not said yes, she had said not yet. Yet found her anyway. Rumors move faster than invitations. A local reporter, more curious than hungry, strolled up the drive with a camera she wore like a necklace and hesitated at the edge of the lawn. Alexander noticed her and did not send her away. He did something braver, he walked to meet her where the grass began. "You'll get your photograph," he said mildly, "and then a cup of coffee and a seat for a small concert, if you like." "Mr. Harrington," she began, but he lifted a hand. "Alexander," he corrected, "because names are how you keep promises to yourself. You can write that I changed a rule that should never have been written. You can write that grief made a coward of me and children made me brave again, if that's the story you see. But if you write that the maid and her children are a scandal, I will send you away without your coffee and without the music, and the story you miss will be better than the one you print." She looked at him for a long heartbeat, weighing the hunger of clicks against the satisfaction of truth. "I'll stay for the concert," she said. "And I'll write what I see." At 4, the hallway filled, staff, gardeners still in their gloves, Eleanor with a plate of cinnamon rolls she had rescued from disappearing, Isabella with Matteo's hand in hers and Sophia clutching a folded program Davies had typed with almost comical formality. Program, a very short concert to celebrate open doors. Alexander sat at the piano. He did not intend to be dramatic. He intended to be sufficient. He played the lullaby first, not to sanctify pain but to put it in its rightful place. It bloomed in the room like a held breath set free. Children stilled in that mysterious, holy way they sometimes do for music, adults let their faces be seen. When the last note dissolved, he did not bow. He looked at Isabella, then at Sophia. "Will you play with me?" he asked the girl. She came shyly, brave anyway, and stood at the treble side. He showed her a simple pattern, 2 notes, then 2 more, and she found them, tentative then bolder, her laughter the metronome. The room applauded as if something enormous had been accomplished, and perhaps it had, the habit of joy, rehearsed and therefore made durable. After the recital, the lawn took the sound and multiplied it. Games appeared as if they'd been hiding in the rose bushes. Matteo napped in the shade and woke up asking for honey bear tea. Children wandered through the blue sitting room to touch the cool of the piano and then ran out again because the sun was too alive to ignore. The reporter snapped her photographs of everything that made rumor unnecessary: sticky fingers, a billionaire wiping jam from his cuff without cursing, a grandmother teaching a child to thread a daisy chain, a maid sitting because at last she could. Near dusk, Lang appeared, blustering up the drive with the swagger of men who confuse access with ownership. He stopped short at the sight, the ordinary chaos of an afternoon well spent. "You've lost your mind," he said under his breath when he reached Alexander. "I've found my house," Alexander replied, not lowering his voice at all. "If the board needs to panic, let them. Panic burns fast. This," he gestured to the scene, "burns slow and keeps you warm. You'll pay for this." "I already have," Alexander said, and for once, the double truth of that sentence made him smile. When the last guest drifted home and the pennants sagged, when Mrs. Patel declared that anyone who left without taking rolls would offend her personally, when Davies announced that the south lawn was quite recovered and, in fact, improved by footprints, Alexander, Isabella, and Eleanor stood at the open doors again, not in farewell, but in inventory. The day had added something to the architecture of their shared life. You could not see it on the blueprints, but you could feel it in your shoulders. "I cannot promise not to be afraid tomorrow," Alexander said softly to Isabella when the twins ran ahead to put their new paper crowns on the pillows. "But I can promise not to build a rule around that fear." She nodded, the only answer that respects promises, acceptance without ornament. "I cannot promise not to protect them too much," she said frankly. "But I can promise to let this house try." They looked at Eleanor. She was watching the twins, who were negotiating the diplomacy of toothbrushing with the solemnity of ambassadors. "My daughter wanted music," she said, smiling toward the piano. "She got it," in the end. Just not in the way we imagined. Later, when the lamps were turned low and the front doors finally, gently, drew almost closed, never again locked from the inside, the house did the unthinkable, it slept well. Not because it had finally silenced grief, but because grief had been given a room with windows and a chair, a place at the table where it could sit and be fed until it was small enough to carry. In the days that followed, the photographs did indeed travel. Some captions were cruel in ways lazy people find clever. But the better story proved heavier, it sank and held. Videos of the tiny concert leaked and were watched not for outrage but for the second when a billionaire hesitated over a phrase and a little girl nudged his finger to the right key. Messages arrived at the foundation from parents with nowhere green to take their children and from men who had built fortresses of their own and were looking for a door handle. If you visited the mansion a month later, you would not find a miracle. You would find shoes by the door and a shelf of paperbacks about birds that had nothing to do with stocks, and a mobile in a small, sunlit room, not the old nursery, which remained a shrine of gratitude and sorrow, but a new space whose name changed with the day, playroom. Homework room. The room where Mateo laughed so hard he spit tea. The house did not become perfect. It became lived in. And that, finally, was better. One evening, Alexander took a folded scrap from a book and smoothed it on the piano lid. The ink had faded, but the looped letters remained, Gabriel. He did not cry. He did not need to. He placed the paper beneath the piano's lid as a person might plant a seed. Then he called down the hall, Sophia, Mateo, are you ready? They ran in, crowns askew, hair carrying the perfume of grass. Isabella followed with that precise blend of readiness and rest that marks a home. Eleanor settled in the corner, hands quiet in her lap, eyes bright the way dusk makes certain things shine. Alexander didn't play the lullaby. He played something new, not quite finished, full of awkward hope and stubborn tenderness. Halfway through, he faltered and looked up in apology. Isabella shook her head. Keep going, she said. It's better when we hear you trying. He did. In the house, which had once outlawed the very sound that might save it, leaned in and listened, and then did the bravest thing it had done in years. It answered back, with laughter in the hall, with a cup placed too hard on a saucer and forgiven, with the quick patter of feet that had learned they were allowed to run. The rule was gone. The music stayed. And the fragile, indestructible truth, tested, chosen, lived, settled over everything like evening, love, when finally let inside, does not ask for permission again.